Thanks everyone for joining us. I go by he, him, by the way. I live in Los Angeles. I was in the ISO for about 15 years. And here and there, I had the chance to be around the French Revolutionary Communist League, which is where Daniel Bensaïd was a militant for a long time. But other than that, my affinities with this Trotskyist tendency of the Fourth International come from my militancy in the ISO over a 15-year period, and finding that this is a tendency that with which we shared a lot of political orientations, I would say, and the closest in many international contexts as well for the ISO coming out of the IST. In many ways, this conversation cannot happen for me and others, I think, in this room without addressing why I think it's important to go back to this essay coming out, 2 years after the dissolution of the ISO. There are still important questions to be discussed and to be parsed out. Not, to reminisce and kind of go back to something or just trash a model where we come from, but rather to recuperate some of what was dynamic in that, I think, and then move forward, right? Because we are in a new period, we are in a new conjuncture, we are in new organizations as well. And so I think that there's some continuity there, though, that's important to take up. So I'll talk about that. I'm gonna try to speak for about 20, 25 minutes. I hope I don't go further than that. And I apologize, I didn't have as much time as I wanted to hammer out like a well-rehearsed presentation. But what I'm going to do is, instead of try to present and synthesize the whole article, which it's about a 15-page article, I think it's very generative. I'm sure that the article is very deep as well in what it covers. So I'm going to try to just bring out some of the main comments, okay, some of the main arguments of this article and its relevance for us today. But I also want to present it as a way that makes it accessible to comrades who are not familiar with Daniel Bensaïd, with some of the arguments that are being made here, right? Or with the politics of the ISO, or et cetera, right? But rather something that I think is relevant for all of us here. So I hope I strike that note right there. Okay. So I think that for me, the reason I'm gonna, my introduction, I'm gonna begin with an introduction and then cover 3 sections. So introduction wise, I wanna point out that for me, this article was very important in my intellectual development after the ISO. The reason why it was important is because as I began to reread some of our classics, this article took me back to the Leninist basics that I thought the ISO was good at stressing. For example, an emphasis on the primacy of politics, on the importance of theory, organization, and also political strategy, and combining those as praxis in the class struggle. And so this article helped me in a way reclaim that Leninism that I think is dynamic and that we always try to work towards in the ISO, even if we were not successful at it ultimately, right? Even if we were stifled by some of our interpretations of the Leninist model, I think that there's a lot to rescue of Leninism. And so this article was crucial for me because it helped me come out of a political depression in a way, right? The article also is important because it helps me think of the party that we are still trying to build today. And Bensaïd's emphasis, I think, is important because there are orthodox and dogmatic positions that he keeps in his interpretation of Marxism and Leninism. And I think it is key to remain orthodox and dogmatic in some senses, right? But still, Bensaïd offers an open Leninism and an open Marxism that I think is very useful for us today. A brief note on who Daniel Bensaïd was. Daniel Bensaïd was a Marxist militant intellectual from France. He was also a professor for a while. He becomes active in politics out of being, part of the milieu coming out of the Second World War. His family and where he lived, right, the Communist Party and its culture was very important in the working class in southern France. His grandfather was also a communard who had come from that tradition of working class politics. And in 1968, Daniel Bensaïd and other young Trotskyists who had been recently kicked out of the Communist Party take a very important role in pushing forward revolutionary politics in 1968 in France. In the aftermath of 1968, Bensaïd and others formed the Revolutionary Communist League, or the Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire, the LCR, in 1975, where he develops this approach of a hurried Leninism, or this kind of fast-paced Leninist approach of sorts. And his political trajectory is one very much part of that Fourth International experience of twists and turns in the 70s, with the armed struggle in the 80s, with the workers, the industrial turn, etc. We can talk about what that means later. But more importantly, I think Daniel Bensaïd really breaks into the international arena of Marxist thinking after the collapse of the USSR with his book, Marx for Our Times, which came out in 1995. And Marx for Our Times is a book that reinterprets Marx out of the orthodoxy of the USSR, in many ways frees Marx from that type of determinism, and offers a new interpretation of Marx for a new left that, that begins to form in the wake of the collapse of the USSR, but also a Marx that is influenced, or rather a Bensaïd's thinking influenced by the Zapatista movement and other, not spontaneous, but rather movements from below, okay? And just to close on Bensaïd, in 2008, the LCR decides to found a new political party, the NPA in France in 2008, and Daniel Bensaïd passes in 2010, okay? And so I think that for me, Bensaïd's work is really important to orient myself as a revolutionary, as a communist today, someone coming from the Trotskyist tradition, because I think his emphasis is always on, when we're taking account of where we are today and where we're going, he argues that we should always start from the middle, because we cannot delight in the illusion that we come from nowhere and that we start from scratch at every moment. Again, he argues that we have to start from the middle, rejecting the temptation of an immaculate beginning, but also rejecting the illusion of political models inherited from history, complete with instruction manuals. Instead, we should look for a compass instead of a manual within Marxism. And so I think that for those of us coming out of the ISO and now integrating ourselves into the left in different ways, it's important, I think, to start from the middle. And that middle, for me, continues being Marxism. Is not only is it right and necessary, right, but it's what can help us come out of the impasse, and Leninism as well, right? And I think that this essay begins with this question of how do we reclaim a revolutionary vision and heritage at a time when there is so much defeatism and opportunism and embrace of the Democratic Party, but also, this kind of reformist socialism that has emerged, right? So what I'm going to cover just briefly in the rest of my presentation is the relevance of Marxism and Leninism today, and Leninist politics, where theory becomes strategy, and just close with some brief questions or lessons for our time, okay? So I think that the article is very clear in bringing up the relevance of Marxism and Leninism. The article begins answering Hannah Arendt's concern that we had reached the end of politics in the 20th century, and that perhaps we were doomed to live in the world as it is, with the infernal repetition of the commodity. And I think that in order for us to kind of understand what is being argued here, but also to break ourselves free from this defeatism of that this is the best we could do as humanity and as a civilization, we need to do deep ideological work of demystification to escape from this notion. And Marxism is what allows us to step back and deconstruct and take apart the situation where we are right now. Following Mark Fisher's reading, Mark Fisher, who wrote the book Capital is Realism, following Mark Fisher, and by way of Alenka Stupanchik, Fisher explains that psychoanalysis invites us to be suspicious of any reality that presents itself as natural. Reality itself is ideologically mediated. One could even claim that it constitutes the highest form of ideology. the ideology that represents itself as empirical, as a fact, or as a necessity. And again, Stupancic argues that it is precisely here that we should be most alert at the functioning of ideology, right? This idea that this is the best that we can do, that there is no alternative, that we have reached the end of history, which Mark Fisher named capitalist realism. And so how do we break from that? So according to Bensaïd, this fatalism fails to recognize that Marxist politics are the only conceivable alternative in the face of capitalized violence and the fetishisms of modernity. And luckily for us, Marx advances a politics of the oppressed, where we aim to build non-state political bodies that prepare the withering away of the state as a separate body from the necessity of humanity and that of the class. We can come up on that. We can touch more on that later. But besides the relevance of Marx, of course, is the relevance of Leninism. And there is one uniting thread that today many people feel comfortable citing and quoting Marx, but they always leave out the revolutionary Marx. And I think that you cannot have Marx without the revolutionary aspect. And this is a very strong connection to Lenin. Because it is in the revolutionary crises, right, where the politics of Leninism are the most important. For us as communists, the question of transforming society and human emancipation remains the defining question. And how are we going to get there? One of the main comments from this article is that the vital, urgent, and I'm quoting now, quote, "The vital, urgent question is that of politics from below. Politics for those who are excluded and cut off from the state politics of the ruling class. We have to solve the puzzle of proletarian revolutions and their repeated tragedies. How do we spurn the dust and win the prize? How can a class which is physically and morally stunted in its daily life by involuntary servitude of forced labor transform itself into the universal subject of human emancipation?" End quote, right? And so for that, Bensaïd reclaims a Leninism that is always intent on intervening in these revolutionary crises. And one of the most exciting parts of this essay, this article for me, is a reclamation of a Leninism that understands the opening of gaps in a time that is out of joint with a linear temporality, where we're talking about looking for these opportunities to make qualitative leaps in social struggle, in crises, right? For Lenin, politics is a time full of struggle and a time of the opportune moment of striking with the balance of class forces, of course, in context, but always striking to try to come out on top, to always try to make a qualitative leap of where we are right now and where we want to go. And I think, again, that is one of the most salvageable aspects of this article, that we always have to be aware of how can we get involved in struggles to make that qualitative leap to our next stage of development as a movement, as a party, as cadre as well. And of course, I also think that it's important to mention that Bensaïd stresses a Leninist party with principles and with organization, with democratic centralism, and also with minority rights for democratic debate and intervention, right? And we can talk more about that in the discussion, but I think that in the post-ISO experience, many people confused, maybe willingly or unwillingly, the defeat of our organization and the crises it faced and it couldn't overcome with the defeat of our politics or the defeat of our overall project. Whether that is today's rejection of democratic centralism and with many ex-revolutionaries, or an overall aversion to the discussion of the need for a vanguard party, for example. Moving on, the relevance of Leninist politics, where theory becomes strategy, I think is important here to pick up. And again, focusing on Lenin's conception of a strategic time within politics, we're talking about a time of politics that's full of breaks, knots, and, following Walter Benjamin, wombs that are pregnant with events. And this is in contradistinction to the social democratic Kautskyist model of thinking of politics as linear, of thinking of politics as relatively mechanical and us getting ready to strike at that opportune moment. On the contrary, Lenin's conception of the party is that of a strategic operator, a gearbox that allows you to shift gears in the struggle with your people to advance the class. In some, Leninist politics can be summarized as be ready, right? Be ready to intervene, be ready to fan the flames of discontent in the working class. And we can again pull more of that in the discussion. For me, I think that, you know, this politics of again, having the, of being thoroughly, or rather having a thoroughly communist goal in mind is that we recognize that it is in crises that, as Lenin argues through Bensaïd, right, that we see politics as the invasion, where that by which was absent becomes present. Rather, what allows us in a way to break through that reality of where the commodity predominates, right, of this normalcy of our everyday life, of alienation, etc. It is in crises where we see the acute class contradictions. And it is in crises where everyday life becomes permeated with politics. And as communists, that is where our strength lies. And that is where we want to intervene in those periods where we have to be, as a party, able to build ourselves in the slow times and in the fast-paced times of struggle, right? And so in those fast-paced times of struggle, like right after the pandemic, like during the summer's uprising, that is where politics invades everyday life. And that is our jam. That is where we must operate with the most urgency, right? To try to prepare the ground for these qualitative leaps. And we can come and talk more about the pandemic of the BLM uprising. But again, one of my critiques of the DSA, which I am a member of here in Los Angeles, is that we missed crucial opportunities to intervene after the pandemic when everyday life was permeated with politics. Right before the uprising, that month of April and May, the class contradictions became very clear. The ruling class was ready to sacrifice us, and still is, right, every day, to sacrifice us for the benefit of capital and corporations. Similarly, with the BLM uprising, it became very clear right away on what side the police is and the state and business versus us and the community and Black people in the United States, right? And so it is in these crises where we must be ready to operate at any given moment, right? Just to close on a few comments. I really appreciate Bensaïd's interpretation of the Leninist Party as a flexible, as one of militant cadres that intervene at crucial moments. Again, I really love the quote of, fanning the flames of all sundry struggles. You never know where the eruption is going to come from, right? It could be this old grievance in a workplace, or it could be, like in the summer, a fucking cop doing what they always do, right? Murdering a Black person in cold blood in front of a camera and thinking they were going to get away with it. And so this, I think, is a very important, a reclamation of that Leninist Party, right? As a gearbox collective that is acting with these goals in mind. So again, this is a politics of Leninism that is ready for the revolutionary crises, where theory becomes strategy, where actual Marxist theory, right? Where it matters what the fuck we think, where it matters what we are or are not reading or discussing as well, And, that militant ideal of the militant who is not a narrow trade unionist, right? Only thinking about economistic issues, but rather a militant cadre that we want to train to become the tribune of the people, right? Who fans the embers of subversion in all spheres of society at any opportunity. That is who we are. Just to close with some lessons and questions for our times, I think that I was very pleased to do this presentation for Denver Communists. I really admire the work that you are all doing in Denver and that of other comrades in Seattle, but also across the country who are organizing and reclaiming these Leninist and Marxist politics, right? We cannot abandon Marxist and Leninist politics and their theory and practice. And I think that that is one of the things that I want to continue doing, talking to comrades who were disillusioned by the collapse of the ISO, but invite them to see themselves in the lineage of Marxist-Leninist struggle in the long term. I also think that moving forward, we must prepare to be ready to make these qualitative leaps in the conflagrations that are to come. And around us, there's a period of crisis. I don't doubt that there will be more coming. I think in Denver, you will have to figure out how you take advantage of the circumstances to make those qualitative leaps. Here in Los Angeles, and I'm also not only my in DSA, I'm part of the Tempest collective. Some of us in that collective are also in DSA, right? We're also trying to see where we can make those qualitative leaps in the arena that we are intervening in. I also think that another important aspect of what Denver Communists is doing, and why I wanted to present this specifically to those comrades that are joining the Denver Communists, is that we must train cadres who can be the tribunes of the people. And those cadres have to be trained in organizing and tactics, right? But also in theory and strategy. One of the most salvageable lessons of the ISO was the emphasis on education, reading, and theory, right? And combining those in praxis. And I think that, that is one of the things that I'm the most proud of my time in the ISO. We always worked to combine theory and practice. We took education very seriously, but also our activist interventions in the movements. To conclude, I want to again, reclaim the urgency of Marxist and Leninist theory for today. I think that our new formations coming out of the ISO experience, the communist movement in general, I think needs to integrate the insights of Daniel Bensaïd in our conception of Marxism, and we need to read more of Bensaïd and his work, which is very generative. There's a new book that is going to come out in the next few years, in the next year or two, by Darren Rosso, a communist comrade in Australia. And lastly, I want to thank, the Denver comrades. I think that part of what we need to continue doing is creating a healthy culture where we can have these discussions, where we can have these spaces of exchange and deepen our Marxist training and understanding. Okay, that's it. Thanks everyone for listening.